How do you land a famous guest for your podcast? This is a question that I get asked a lot by podcast hosts that are starting the show. Maybe they want a specific guest, maybe they want a celebrity, maybe they want someone in the fitness space, maybe they want someone in the real estate investment space. And you may be asking yourself, how can I land a celebrity guest on my show? And for me, the way that worked is I was going off, I was starting my own podcast. I didn't have a ton of listenership, didn't have a ton of downloads. It was new, it was coming off the ground. And what I had done is I created a list of 50 specific people that I wanted to have on my podcast. And these were entrepreneurs and authors, different people that were very inspirational to me. And what I had done with that is I made it specific. So I wasn't just reaching out to any old person that had no impact on my life. And what I had done is I built out this list and I really just worked that list of those 50 different individuals. Some of them I never heard back from. Some of them said, I would love to be a guest when your podcast gains a little bit more traction or has more episodes. I had other guests say, I'd love to be a guest once your podcast starts reaching 1,000 downloads per episode. But then I was able to land that first, I guess you would say, celebrity guest. So for my industry, when I was starting the podcast, was in the entrepreneurial space. So the guest that I was having on was Mike Dillard. Mike Dillard is a very successful online entrepreneur. I listened to his podcast back in the day, Self-Made Man. I was part of his content. I think he had different groups that I had attended and was just learning a lot from him. So I reached out to him and just told him like how much of an inspiration he has been to me. You know, it would mean a lot for him to come on my podcast. And I was able to land him to come on to my show. But picture this, I reached out to 50 different individuals and it was a lot of work. I mean, I wrote very specific pitches for every single person. If you think that you're going to land a celebrity guest on your podcast and it's not going to take a ton of work, well, that could be the case if you're already a very successful podcast, you already have a large following. But if you're a newer podcaster, like myself was, to land a celebrity guest, it was definitely going to be a lot more difficult. But what I found is all of a sudden I had Mike Dillard come on the podcast. And now all of a sudden I was able to name drop him. And just different entrepreneurs I was able to get was like Dan Locke and Ryan Stewman, Jay Papasan, David Osborne, Tim Sykes, Joel Brown, and just all these different entrepreneurs were able to come onto my podcast. And this was really because I landed that first big guest, but it probably took about a month or two of me writing pitches, getting rejected, and just consistently going out there and trying to land one of these individuals. And again, I wasn't just reaching out to anyone. Like as an example, let's just say a big name, let's say in the entrepreneurial space, you have Alex Hormozi. And I have no relation to him. I haven't read his book other than I know a lot of people like his content. Or let's just say you have Russell Brunson from ClickFunnels. I haven't used ClickFunnels before. Like, oh, I'd love to have him on. He's a big name. A lot of people know him. Well, it's going to be hard for me to be specific to him if I haven't used his product or service. Or Mike, I'd actually use his product or service. For like David Osborne, Jay Papasan, I read their book. Ryan Stewman listened to his podcast. Tim Sykes listened to his podcast. Joel Brown, I believe at the time, on the site Addicted to Success, and I was always going on and reading his blogs. And that's how I used that. It was people that I liked and I respected that maybe they weren't a celebrity in terms of your typical celebrity status, but they were a celebrity in my eyes based on the success that they had built. And getting that first guest on the show was the hardest. And then once I got that first guest on the show, then I just used their name. Now all of a sudden I'm reaching out to different individuals and I'm saying, hey, I've had Mike Dillard, David Osborne, Jay Papasan, Ryan Stewman, Dan Locke on my show. I'd love for you to come on to our show. And it's easy to name drop like that because then it becomes more, I wouldn't say respectable, but it just becomes easier. That's just the best way to say about it because they want to know who else has been on the show. Oh, these 5 successful individuals have been on this podcast. Then I should also be a guest on that podcast. And yeah, it's a lot of work, but it's definitely well worth it. So that's how you land a celebrity guest on your podcast. I mean, I wish there was a simple way. For me, it was just being specific, creating a list of 50 different individuals, reaching out to them, working the list through email, LinkedIn, social media, and just getting that first big name on the show and then leveraging that name to pick up these other big names on the show. And that's not one of the reasons why you should just have a podcast, is to talk to these successful individuals. I want to talk to these people because they had inspired me and I looked up to them and I just wanted to have a conversation with them. And that's really why I used and started the podcast back in the day. Well, I no longer run that podcast now, and I run a different podcast today. That was part of the reason, is I knew I couldn't reach out to them and say, hey, can I pick your brain for 30 minutes? But I could have them on my podcast and I could basically pick their brain for 30 minutes. But it's not, technically speaking, that's not what it would look like. So I hope that's been helpful. And that's exactly how I landed a celebrity guest on my podcast.